It's a privilege to be here, to be asked to speak. I have given a few tours. I don't see any familiar faces, so it's good that for most of you, if I don't detect that, this will be new territory for you. In terms of as readers of the building, if I am considered a writer, there are stories that the building can communicate itself, but there are also stories that someone needs to translate and convey to you that provide some additional interest and background. So I'm thrilled to be here to share some of those stories, which I've done, as I said previously, on some various tours. I also want to note, because you'll see in the lower left-hand corner here, while the attribution of my vision is what you experience here on campus, that it does take a lot of people to make this happen. I do want to make sure that we credit Ewing Cole, particularly Rebecca Vargas, who many of you have seen around on campus with me, and even my, I'll say, former colleagues, Einhorn, Yaffe, Prescott. It took all of us, plus Bar and Bar, and of course Herman Martinez and the entire seminary community to make this happen. So I want to at least acknowledge that standing up here in front of you, I'm representing a small division of people who were involved with the making, the realization, the planning, the organizing of the library. And it's still, in some ways, it's a work in progress still. As most of you know, I mean, a great example of that is the Brick Cafe, and I'll tell you some of those details later. But if nothing else, then we can say the vision has to do with giving you the scaffolding to make the changes that you need over time, because as a site that is destined to have libraries on it and regretfully has seen too many libraries destroyed, we'd like to have this one hang out for a couple of years. So it's got to be adaptable and resilient in that way. So Theological Libraries Month. Dawn asked me if I was willing to speak, and one of my colleagues up in Boston said, "Wow, this is pretty arcane. This is pretty unique. This is a focused audience, isn't it?" I said, "Well, you know, you got to take what you can." And they've asked me to speak, and I'm for it. We were laboring, of course, this time of year, even in Princeton. I was walking along the canal, running along the canal this morning. October is typically a month we think about, you know, the harvest, the foliage, the wonderful display that nature gives us. But no, it's really, in fact, it's also about Theological Libraries Month, and in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, not to be outdone, there's another small group of people that it's also White Cane Awareness Month, or White Cane Safety Month. So I saw this billboard driving in to town a couple of weeks after Don had asked me to speak, and it's like, wow, October's a pretty full month, and pretty specialized month, and not to disparage either an instrument, but it was pretty inspiring for me to see this, and actually to recognize that it wasn't theology or blind awareness, right? It was actually about the instruments that enable us to make this happen. So as simple and seemingly arcane as the cane, there it is. It's a White Cane awareness and not blind awareness. And in the similar fashion, it's about theological libraries, not about the dissemination or the relay of theology. So towards that end, of course, I'm saying, wow, October is actually a very pragmatic time. And we can parse it into these smaller units. So I thought that was really great, this sort of parallel. Towards that end, the mission as planned, conceived, executed, the library, the new seminary library was envisioned to be a library to the world. It was going to be celebrating the bicentennial of the seminary, and to that extent, the ideal was, let's not make much to expand the mission of theological librarians. Let's not make it just for the faculty, staff, administration, and students in theological settings, but let's make it a library to the world. Multiple theological settings, but also to the world at large. It's certainly also meant that it's not just global, as much as we know that we have the facilities here to talk to people on the other side of the world, to have video conferences, to have concurrent classroom experiences, that while we're here we can talk to other people around the world, whether it's on site or in another academic environment. It's also a building that has a physical presence here, right? That it covers and offers the benefits and the needs and the immediacy of people on campus, people who live next door. It is certainly a resource for the community as we know it is local, but also the community that is global. So taking the seminary deep into its third century, the idea here, the big idea here, is to break down the barriers, right? To break down what might be seen as the distinction between the world of scholarship and the world outside. And certainly in the predecessor that sat on this site, it seemed like that was a pretty clear barrier. And that was part of our goal, was to eliminate that barrier. It's also, in some fundamental way, the agenda was to make a library of last resort with approximately 1 million volumes of collections. And there's this little bit of marketing spin that talks about, is it third or second place to another well-known library in Vatican City, which was news to me because someone had been making this pronouncement quite repeatedly over the past 7 years, and this has been a 7-year-long project. So regardless of the statistics, the mission was a library of last resort, right? That one could find the answers they needed here, certainly in the Western Hemisphere at least, but certainly that was the place here, that we could offer the setting for the librarians and the staff and the faculty to do the work that would provide the answers for these questions that were being searched and researched. As well, part of the agenda has to do with taking the library forward. We heard in the master planning process in the past couple of weeks, President Barn has actually rephrased it quite nice. From traditional roots to innovation. Innovation isn't necessarily about architecture, but innovation is about the way we think about how to research, how to minister, and the like. So in our sense, in terms of an architect, what we really have control over is the physical realm. Innovation meant taking traditional elements, traditional motifs that could be used to enhance the agenda of the library to the world, one that would begin to break down the barriers between the world of scholarship inside and the world that is out and beyond. So I'll get into more detail, but in simple terms, what you see here in the image, starting with the idea of this rough-hewn masonry, that the building wants to be timeless in the sense that it appears to be rising out of the earth. It also didn't want to be manufactured stone. The stone wanted to be, appearing to be, and in fact was, each piece individually made, harvested from the earth, and individually set. And for those of you who have been on campus for the past 4 years, you've heard that chinking away for every piece of stone that went into the assembly of this exterior wall. And that's really important because it does reinforce the notion that this was made by human hands, and it has thereby that human scale, the human touch, and the associated human story. The other component here that's quite dramatically prominent is the bay window. The bay window, in cursory, sort of succinct, distilled terms, is a secular version of an ecclesiastical oriel window, which was associated with chapels in pre-Reformation churches and chapels, chapel windows. So we've taken it as the sort of motif that we could clip onto this rough-hewn masonry wall, clearly engineered, clearly prismatic in its feel, and clearly the contrast would provide us some sense that one would have to look twice to actually discern when the building, like, was it made 200 years ago or was it made today? We really were concerned with the timelessness of the building, that it really needed to stand the test of appearing of no particular era or betraying at least no special era, but in fact trying to transcend those sorts of cues or clues that we associate with when buildings are built. So that's one thing, in fact, that we see here. And of course, she's a little darkened, but you see that it wasn't just about how one can see inside, but also the connecting people back to the campus. In many cases, mid-century libraries that are overtly modern or like Spear had been cloaked in some prison Gothic garb really had no sense of the campus outside. It was not, and I think this is very important that the libraries today are places for people, or certainly for connecting people to the resources, but it's important, again, going back to the mission, that we are constantly aware that we are in the world when we're in the world of scholarship. So that connectivity back to the campus was very important. Part of the brief was also to create inviting and inspirational spaces, a variety of those types of spaces. And here's a photograph from last week, the festivities last week, on suggesting on the one hand that the community can be almost civic in its domain and its realm. A bit awkward now because the only space one can do these sorts of activities on campus is embedded in the center of the library. So we're sort of trying to see if there are other places that we could construct in the future that might sort of alleviate that demand. But certainly that's part of the agenda here. It is to create a sense of community within the library and to establish its identity deep in the center of the library. And there are other ways that we were dealing with that atrium. And then, of course, it came a sort of latter day. You may recall the cafe was not a very friendly place. It was just a sort of small, stylized version of a healthcare sort of cafeteria with some self-serve vending machines. And fortunately, the Brick Church, Brick Presbyterian Church in Upper East Side in Manhattan reminded certain folks on the board and campus that there really should be a cafe and then someone should make coffee. And we took it from there. As you well know, we did the work while the building was being finished. The building actually was already occupied. So it was we thought it was a very gracious gift on behalf of the Brick Church. But importantly is the intimacy. So we have the range of inviting and inspirational spaces that we can go from the civic domain to the quiet, to the individual domain, even in a cafe. So that, as an agenda, was the challenge, was to address all these issues: the library to the world, the library of last resort, inviting inspirational places, innovation from tradition. So the physical facts in terms of the challenges, the big one, of course, is Luce was going to remain. Once we had determined that Spear was no longer either functionally or even more particularly damning, structurally viable anymore, that it had to come down, then what do we do to make sure that it's an operationally as well as perceptibly a single building? The building, and I'll call it Luce, it's a shorthand, or otherwise the building formerly known as Luce, was what we were presented with the demolition of Spear and the removal of the bridge. Ironically, the bridge from between Spear and Luce did further, I think, to enhance the perception of separation than it was to actually make the connection. So in our minds, the issue here was really, what can you do to bring light deep into the building, create a sense of organization? It was also, for both buildings, Spear and Luce, the lower level, the basement level, was no man's land. I mean, it just wasn't a place to go in either case. So in addition to the agenda for bringing light in, for offering the sort of organizational focus embedded in the overlap where Luce and the new construction would occur, also providing what was critical is open vertical circulation, so that as an organizational device, one knows where everything's happening in the building. And you even can't see it in this, but in fact, not just education per se or learning, but also where the books are. So that was very important as if you will, an invention to create a space that was going to provide this sense of orientation. And of course, we had never anticipated that sort of active civic realm that it might take up. we did talk about concerts. We did talk about whether it should be a cello space or a piano space. I understand it's a small symphony orchestra space as well. But that, I think, is positive. I know it's a disturbance for the typical users in the library, and we know there are places behind closed doors that you can minimize that. But I think it's important that a lot of events can occur in the library, that it really is vibrant, it really is alive, and a lot of different ways to document experiences, to have these wonderful experiences, as well as to provide a place for people to be. I think this is part of what we were seeing in terms of the creation of an atrium at the heart of the building. Wants to jump ahead. The other challenge, of course, with one building, much less two buildings, is that of service. My experience with libraries, and I've only done about a dozen of them on campus, but there's a lot of different activities vying for that ground floor, right? And then typically there's only going to be one way in. You want to have that control point so that, well, at least in former age, it was about controlling people coming in, but this is an open library, but also controlling the flow of books out, or making sure that books are being checked out before they left. So the issue there is providing the proper environment as a passage. In some places we call them commons, information columns, or commons, or knowledge commons, to actually do that initial grab and go or one-stop sort of idea about I can get information at a kiosk like this. I can sit down between classes or between appointments and read a current periodical. I can go ask Kate a question. I can see that there are a lot of things going on here. I can ask questions. I can talk to people. I hear people actually on the phone in the concourse with their earbuds on. So there is this built-in zoning in the building that would allow the type of space when you come through the gates to have that sort of vibrancy. The quiet areas are further away. They're zoned closer to the perimeter of the building. You'll notice, of course, that one idea that was prominent here is reference was going to stay. This is an institution that was pretty clear about reference as a bona fide important activity, because in many institutions, reference becomes subject librarians, or it actually become folded into the whole service point. So this was an important, to have this sort of multiple help or service points, and that was part of the whole agenda here. As well, the vibrancy, right? Yes, Kate, you were there. In fact, if you can count the number of librarians and count the number of architects and count the number of times we have a photographer in the image, the photographer is actually in this image. We'll award you a prize at the end of the lecture. But what's important here, again, is the variety of activities that can go on. In addition to the photographer ransacking Kate's office, we have display, the study, because it is a very popular place for people to study, as well as the normal day-to-day need for getting some answers to urgent questions about where I can find certain information. Variety of learning environments. With a variety of learners, and then, I think this is important sort of terminology that's been developed in the past 10 years, that we don't teach anymore, we learn. Which is, I'm a learner. As Dawn said, I have been teaching for 30 years, but I'm a learner, so I'm learning to live with that. But with the variety, and particularly with the age sort of range here, the average, the median age of seminarian is 29. Is that right? Somewhere in there, Shane? So we have both the mid-career shift. I actually, part of our master plan, I interviewed a student who said this was his fourth career. Journalism was one of those intermediates, so I'm not quite sure where that was going. And then you have if you will, the kids that have come right out of school. So we have a huge cross-section, and that's just in the sort of purely academic realm. And in fact, these are engineering students from the university. Great little anecdote. When we were taking the photographs, Kate was so protective, right? We could not come in during finals, because it would be disruptive. And of course, Robert Benson, the photographer, and I, we've done these wonderful architectural photography sessions during finals. And what more could you ask for than having teeming hordes of students studying hard at the desk, the whole bit. To her credit, Kate said, no way, you're not going to distract them. So we had to come in, and we did come in several hours after the last exam had been scheduled to take some photographs. But the university students still had finals. It's great. I think this is wonderful for us. That
genuine anxiety.
As well as I think the what started with Barnes and Nobles and Starbucks in bed probably, 15, 20 years ago now, the idea that a learning environment could actually occur in a retail environment was pretty new, but has become actually sort of a formula now. But given the opportunity and the resources, we amped it up a bit and said, this is important. Like we've also learned in libraries about the presence of food and drink. This is all important, and this creates the vitality. And we'll get to the other topic later on. We want to actually people stay here, right? Once they get here, I'll tell you what the problem is, and if you probably already know. So a variety of learning environments, certainly even in the atrium, right? 5 different ways. I understand from Kate, and I see, right, these are very popular, the sort of traditional carol. I never would have imagined that popular in such a prominent place. To have that privacy, but be in the middle of it all is really unique. There's what was the exterior tower on the building formerly known as Luce. The tree house where you saw those engineering students before. Current periodicals, work in progress. And then the sort of open sort of lounge seating, which we see various people in various poses or rare poses. So even in the atrium, right, you're giving choices for people of how they want to study, how they want to search, or how they want to socialize. Not to diminish the role of books, but libraries have become a social function, and we think that's very important to reinforce that. Certainly on this campus, and certainly on this site on campus. Then, of course, in some people's minds, the raison d'etre for the seminary is the PhD program. And that will play very prominently into the planning and the design of the building. And of course, we also wanted to make sure that it wasn't a monastic experience, but in fact, it was very important that this visibility that we're talking about, whether it's from the outside looking in as one sees at night more clearly, or from the inside looking out, that we also provided that simple sort of motif for the PhD students upstairs. The challenge of collections. This project started actually saying there might be as many as 2 million volumes down the road. There were challenges to that. And this is a very, I won't say critical time, but certainly a very important time to address the question of whether, let's just say in a non-mutually exclusive world, whether it's print or digital, right? Do collections get culled out because we can get it digitally? Do periodicals become almost primarily digital? Of course, I'm talking to a lot of librarians, and I'm going to sound a little ignorant on it, but still these seem to be reoccurring questions now in the digital age. But as we all know, when we saw it coming, the digital era was portending that physical libraries would actually disappear. Right? There would be no need for a physical place for libraries from many sort of visionaries. I didn't buy into it. I clearly have not bought into it. It's not a mutually exclusive world. And as well, it's just another portal, right? That knowledge comes in different ways. The gray with time, to use the term that came out this past week. We need to be gray with time, which means there are a variety of different ways we can get to this information. But then how do we plan for it? The 2 million volumes, physical volumes, meant a book box. And in this case, we looked at a robotic warehouse that would have been sitting in the parking lot next door in some moderate way becoming incorporated into the building. The price tag was pretty exorbitant, and it began to suggest sort of questions about, well, really, why are we going for 2 million volumes, even as a library of last resort, when in fact, with the digital era, a lot of this stuff, Google, everyone else, could be addressed online. So 1 million seemed to be a good number, approximately. And knowing with the fluctuations that could be accommodated for the next 20, 30 years. And again, anyone who tries to predict beyond that, or actually predict beyond the next 5 years, is probably selling you real estate in some specious place. What was important in the planning of the building for collections was the immediacy of the presence of the books, right? That they weren't going to hide in some place and you weren't going to get lost. And as you see in the atrium, this is the collection. There's the 1 million volumes in basic terms. I know there's a lot of books in the loose book box, as I'll show you in the plan, but it was important that we have that presence of the volumes in the building. In fact, when I come up these stairs, I can't avoid the books, right? I'm going to bump into them as I head my way towards Women in Ministry or the South Gallery. Similarly, in terms of collections, is the formality, if you will, of how we work amongst books, and not just the storage of books that you have here and making all the floors with compact storage, which essentially doubles the capacity from fixed ranges, but also accommodating an environment which invokes the tradition, which I'll be corrected, but I think it's about a 17th century invention where we start to say we will work in rooms with other people with books adjacent, which is a pretty new idea, versus St. Catherine or St. Jerome, where you're sitting by yourself at a window looking outdoors and there's a lion and a peacock and all kinds of other life next to you, but you're by yourself. So this was a function, a sort of invention that came from the Enlightenment, in the sense of I'm sitting in a room with other scholars researching and the books are right there beside me. So we felt that tradition of the reading room was important, and the presence of the books was also important. And in the context of utilizing both buildings and all floors in both buildings, we depressed it deep into the ground. We did, of course, as you know, we terraced it down with the boulders, and it's starting to mature now, but it's quite a wonderful experience late in the day, whether it's spring, fall, or winter, when the sun does come in and dig deep into the space. Sort of being in the earth and of the earth and looking up at the sky sort of reinforces in our minds the sort of quality, the wonderful, compelling quality of this space. Other aspects about the collections, right? We know that there's just all these other sort of smaller categories. This was something we left into a certain way. I don't know what to do with microfilm, microfiche anymore. I mean, it's an institutional call. Do we leave it or do we put it away? And every library project, this comes to some very serious discussion about, are people using this? And, it's like QR codes. I mean, in some cases, let's just hold on to it. There's no reason. We are the repository. Let's hold on to it. So it's at a very prominent spot in the building. So maybe there'll be a revival, but is there, and it's important. Certainly even new collections. And having that sort of menu of all these different things that occur in the concourse. So, and even current periodicals. And to be fair, this is work in progress. We're trying to accommodate what we think are the physical print volumes that are coming in. We felt like it should be on the ground floor. And you see in this sort of composite plan, the idea that when I'm in the atrium, I'm close to the books. I have a chance. Now, we know that Ken keeps his stuff pretty well secured back in there, but I'm in and amongst the books, as well as being deep in a building. And this is also important, that I can be deep in a building, still have outside light, and still see the books at the same time. I mentioned the sort of phenomena of getting people here and keeping them here. I've worked on a lot of campuses in my 30 years, small, large. I don't think I've ever encountered such a challenge as a campus where the library, if you will, if Miller Chapel is the soul, the library is the heart. In some places it is the heart and soul of an institution. It is separated by city streets from the rest of the campus, right? Can anyone tell me of another place where that occurs? I mean, it's usually right in the center of everything, right? You can't avoid it. Well, in this case, you actually have to make the deliberate choice to come here. And And as we're I took this diagram from the master plan in the sense of, I've got to cross streets to get here. So if I have to cross streets, I've got to start to think about how to pull people in, or invite them in, or to at least make it appear accessible. Program, of course, was important, and I'll talk about that. But how can we make a building, and how can you locate a building that actually will sponsor people, not just to have to make a deliberate decision, but if I'm, say, coming from Erdman or from the tenant campus to Stewart Hall, right? Get me as close as I can to the building as part of the pedestrian network. And even when I get there, engage people in that. So that's part of what is the, I guess we could say otherwise, the invention of this colonnade, and that is to have this permeable sort of piece that is, of course, is the representation that I talked about in terms of the character of the building that we see as the essential character speaking to the voice of the seminary and its presence in the world. But also, this isn't just a little folly. This is actually to pull people in, to create a place outdoors, as well as to create that transition zone, the sense that I can actually come into the building and it's friendly, it's inviting. This was a way to make it to appear to be permeable, to appear to be inviting. Gothic as an architecture, as we know from Spear, can be a little intimidating because it actually is particularly if a cold limestone, it can be a little bit of a detriment. So our point here was to show the perforations, to show the openings, to get people to come in. Corresponding to that, of course, is this library to the world and the visibility of everything that's going on in the building. Right? Certainly it was easy. We knew we had to break down the scale of a large building into a more residential scaled proposition for the folks who live on Library Place or in the neighborhood to the southwest on Library Place. So the reference reading room was an easy one in terms of creating that scaled down pavilion, that sort of warmth. I remember the first time we saw the lights in there that had been installed at night. It was a cold December night, and it was like, wow, this is the place I just want to go. I can see the books. I think that's also important, again, from the outside. So the visibility, and certainly in a night shot, this is an easy one for me to document, but is also important because we talk about the bay window as an invention, or at least a sort of transformative way to make it an invasive part of the sort of building. But also, as I've said to a few people before, this is a fire stair. I mean, when it's all said and done, this is just a fire stair. And I have had the good fortune to have been working in the University of California system, which has some very stringent requirements for efficiency and code requirements for egress. And in many cases, you didn't have the budget for the additional stair that we have in the atrium. You could only have the fire stairs. So left to their own creative devices, the architects that are working on these campuses in the UC system have to make these inviting places. They're not just those dark tubes that we get lost in once we actually are leaving the world when we go into these fire stairs. And it's predominant in buildings that were built since 1945. I think we all know them. You go into this fire stair and you're gone. You don't even know where you're going, and you don't know where you're going to end up. But we were pretty adamant, and even somehow fighting the client's representative, lovely Ira Fink, and he's from California, ironically, working from Berkeley, but we really insisted on having these stairs be used. I worked at the Olin Library in St. Louis, had similar exit stairs that were black tubes. They found prayer mats. Right? This is great, but this isn't. We'll make a space for prayer mats. We don't use an exit stair for that sort of quiet activity or this dark sort of world. So that's important here in terms of visibility. One, I can see people going up and down in the building. It's really great. But two, in the building, I actually can see the world as I go up and down, even when I'm not in the atrium. The visibility also isn't just about what we see from the outside. It has to do with being out there. I employed the bay window as a way, literally it's a device that allows the most amount of light In fact, it allows you to be outside of the building while you're still inside the building. Again, to break down the barrier that says that traditionally there's a distinction between the world of scholarship and research and the world that's outside, to get people out there, to have that sense that we are in the world. And here, of course, is the classic example for me, was the opportunity presented by the corner and having this bay motif running along the south face. When you're out here, you're literally outside the building. You're just sort of perched way out there. And I've heard from a few students, one in particular who actually he guns for getting a seat up there at like 9 o'clock or 8:30 in the morning, whatever. But I've heard from students that when it's snowing and you're up and sitting at that table, it's quite a spectacular experience. And in fact, on a day like today, I suspect it's quite a spectacular experience. But the point for us was an intention was to break down that barrier, to actually have the sense that you are in the world, you're constantly being connected to the world. In fact, if I go back, to when I'm in a space like this, so I apologize for the quality of the photograph, but when I'm standing here on either this floor or the third floor, you see, I can always see the outside world. And actually from multiple, I can just sort of stand, do a 360 degree rotation. I can always see the exterior deep in the building. And I think that's really important, that we make sure that you're constantly not lost in the world. I mean, it's going to be hard enough as someone who loves to browse ranges, love the random act of pulling books out when I'm walking down the ranges. And you do get lost in some figurative way there. But this is really great that we can actually provide the means to keep natural daylight, to keep you oriented in the building. So that's part of the strategy for what the window was. Also, the idea of visibility isn't just as well looking outside from inside or from the outside to the inside, but also visibility within the building. I guess what we can say is modern architecture and the technology that was developed with modern architecture has now matured enough that we can use glass, we can use glazing with sufficient care and craft to keep the cost down, but also make it effective. We can control and temper the environment inside versus the harsh climate outside. But also, rooms don't need to be opaque. Right? That I can make rooms that are glass now that provide the necessary acoustical separation. And so I get something like this. I called this, we made it up, and Don contested it's not really a word because he can't find it in the dictionary, but it is the atriette. Right? That when I come in the door downstairs, I can actually look up, I can look to I see people, I see books, I can see the microfiche. I can see the cafe, I see this room, I see the cert desk. I actually get a sense of what's going on in the building. And in fact, it's very important that the first 30 feet I actually have a sense of what's going on in the building. And glass and the current technology for glass that we didn't have 30, 40 years ago allows us to do that. Right? We have that constant visibility so that I can carry on here, and there'll be loud conversations downstairs. I'm separated, but I still have this visual connection. And certainly, the fact that I can see those books down on the lower level, these are actually below grade, is really important. This is really, I'm counting 5 panes of glass between myself and the exterior world here. Right? So what this allowing is similar to the photograph I just showed you, is that I'm at just about at the same point I took the other photograph of the microfilm equipment, right? That I can turn around 270 degrees or 180 degrees and there's the outside world, but 4 layers of glass in between even before I get to the exterior wall. And then the exterior wall is even out beyond there. That's the tower you see here. So it was important to use glass, not judiciously, but quite luxuriously, as we did with the classroom stack that's there by the stair. The whole point there was to have the visibility of learning. Right? We can do things to glass, as you see, with Fritz that provide some sense of privacy, but it was really important that we utilize in every aspect of the experience of the building this concept of visibility and transparency. In terms of another challenge, that is we have to tear a building down. And we don't like doing that traditionally on campuses, particularly on this site, because we know buildings disappeared in the middle of the night or they burned down. But how do we maintain continuity, sort of institutional continuity, despite differing senses of what were the mission goals, the desirable outcomes of buildings in the earlier era? One instance that presented itself to us, and this is a classic one too. I mean, this is a boardroom that was in your former library. It's a boardroom, right? You can't move the furniture. You can't actually do much in here. I don't recall whether it was locked or not. I don't know if you could actually use it. Yeah. So here was a room in a library that no one particularly liked anyway, that was never used until the board was here, or some faculty. That's right. But generally, a room that's locked. I mean, that was never on our agenda, right, for the planning of this building. And I think that's not about the architects or the planners. That's about the sort of institutional evolution that this is a resource. It should be open to as many people as possible. We need to get people into the building. We want to make sure that they're aware of the resources we have here. Well, towards that end, of course, we know that this room's going to disappear with all of its secured accoutrement. But we have these wonderful fixtures that could never be duplicated again these days. These cast, or spun, I should say, bronze. And we said, well, what a great opportunity to, in a space where people will use it, polish them up, add some stems, relamp to LED, because it is an up and down light of a particularly elegant era. But in fact, I have to say, they're just too tight, as you can see from the photograph. They were too tight to the ceiling in this particular installation, but quite marvelous little light fixtures. So we took the 8 of them, put the stems on them, polished them up, and installed them in the reference reading room. And I think in our minds, you know, it may seem token, but it's so important. These were wonderful things that were made. They're artifacts, and that's part of what we thought is really important for at least the sense of continuity, the mission of the seminary. Like many institutions, it's going to be here when we're gone. It was here before we were here. Let's reinforce that with artifacts that will sort of maintain that sort of presence over time. Along with the interior marble that was in the lobby of Spear that you'll see set into many of the tables in the building here. Even the cafe tables that are in there, that's from the wall behind the stair at Spear. Some of the blocks you see in these retaining walls came from the exterior. So we did try to be considerate. I'll use the term sustainable in terms of the reuse of materials that would contribute to a sense of, you know, the continuing identity of the institution. So that was for us a really exciting example. Then there's another one, I guess, and that is, okay, we've got this isolated site. We've had this unfortunate precedent of buildings that either don't stand the test of time or they're just not friendly. How do we mark the site, right? What's the precedent for marking the site? What's the idea here that will allow not just the folks here at the seminary to see that this is the resource for them to utilize, that sort of beacon, if you will, but how do we literally put the marker on site to say this is an important component of our lives here at Princeton Seminary? Looking around, I spent a couple of weeks in very cold February, probably 5 years ago now, walking all around Princeton, looking at various examples of not just the university, but also just buildings in town. And of course, what you see here that's pretty consistent is how a building meets the sky, right? That's really what it comes down to in terms of what's the visage, what's the profile, what is it we're doing? Actually, we're actually looking up to the sky. And certainly during that time, I do recall one of my favorite places to eat breakfast when one is eating breakfast in Mackay is the northernmost porch where I could get a direct view of the Cleveland Tower. It was one of those wonderful moments where you realize where you are. Again, that connectivity to the world we're in as seminarians. So I was looking around, the wonderful Copeland Stewartson, who was a local Philadelphia firm, very talented young men who died at a premature age. And then, of course, the precedent for a direct typology of the Firestone Library down the street. But certainly offering for us the idea of how does a building meet the sky in order to mark the presence of the activity, the presence of the institution. But also, there's another component that you see here that is present that began to sort of sink into my wee brain during that cold February week, and that is the arch. The arch provides that sense, that collegiate sense of portal, of passage, the sort of sanctified passage, if you will, that says what's going on through here is important. It's not just about the marker to the sky, and of course, as you see, in most cases, that arch is related to some passage, but it's not directly related to the tower itself. And even these turrets, like they're all flanked to the side. This is actually St. John's College, Cambridge. It's just a knockoff that Cope and Stewartson also did in St. Louis at WashU. But knockoffs that we all like, because there's an integrity to how they built it. And of course, Cram is a master at the management of different sources of architecture to make a style that was uniquely his own. Well, not that would be possible for me to compare myself to these guys, but we clearly had to invent something that would make of a similar sort of temperament, simpler motivation, simple move, that would start to offer a place for us to think about, this is the library at the seminary. This should be really important. So there we go. We looked at the pre-Reformation Gothic component of the traditional, I'll call it the broken arch. Tweaked it a bit, didn't want to do any knockoffs, and also in the context of a tower that certainly in this midday photography emphasizes the textural quality of the material, which is exactly what we're gunning for. That you can get this sort of engineered, sort of precise look of a dressed stone, but against the contrasting sort of rubble, again, laid by hand, stacked one upon the other. So that was really important to see that. And this stone is particularly unique. It's a sandstone quartzite from upstate New York, puts it within a 500-mile radius. So we, by modern standards, we can call that sustainable because it's being harvested local. And of course, what's interesting that it seems like the past 50 years we lost that sort of idea of being connected to the land that's here and getting the stone locally. Now we can get it from China, we can get it from India, we can get it from any number of places in Africa or Europe. But before that era, all the stone was local. We'd always go local. So now what we're finding to be sustainable is in fact the way people used to make buildings 100 years ago, and even longer, because they had more vested there and they had less resources to transport. So this was also important that, but we had to put it on the boat, send it to Carrara, because no one would touch it here. It's very hard, very brittle stone. It does have an absorptive quality. Sometimes you can see it does register some of the moisture that's there, but it is a quartzite. It's very hard, and at least the myth is that there weren't any fabricators that wanted to handle it here. So the 23 pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Sorry, the number of pieces that were sent to Carrara, as well as the columns, were turned on the lathe in Carrara. So despite the fact they're from 500 miles, within 500 miles, that we had to send them abroad to have them fabricated. We thought it was worth it. During the project, this was a bit of a challenge. I've told various people that I probably would still be designing the tower today if it wasn't forced on me to cut it off, stop the activity, because we had to build it. These are marvelous ways to, in some ways, non-programmatic in any functional, pragmatic terms, even though we have programmed each of the rooms that are in there. But I guess the question is, why do we do this? And I'm saying that because Mr. Vorp here has this wonderful knack of sending out these sort of missives, like at 6 o'clock in the morning. You've probably seen them as well, right? Which basically is sort of like, why are we doing this? Like, why do we do this? And he was basically, Rayford, in 2 or 3 sentences, what is the significance of the tower and the arch? What were we trying to do? I don't know who the audience was or for what purpose, but I'm like, whoa, Don, it's already there. So I'm going to sort of read to you in the context why we did the tower, or I should say the fact that's there. The tower is physical as it literally guides one's eyes to the heavens and cosmos, and thus it is symbolic of the expansive character of its purpose. But supportively, it is also a beacon, a traditional marker of safety and enlightenment. As part of the library's outreach and reaffirming presence in the Princeton community, we also saw the tower, amongst the many others in the vicinity, as a building element and a welcoming icon, signifying its role in the common fellowship of scholarly pursuits. As many towers generally are impenetrable, the arch was employed, specifically the broken arch, so prevalent in Gothic, Neo-Gothic, and in the case of the Princeton context, Collegiate Gothic, to emphasize the importance of the experience of entry through a threshold into the realm of inquiry and collaboration, and thereby establishing a sanctified portal into a nurturing place of search and research. I don't know. This architect. In tandem, the ecclesiastical nuance of the arch notched into the simple and protective suggestion of a baronial tower, because we were, of course, looking at traditional Scottish architecture, knowing that the heritage of the spear tablets that Menconi fabricated for John Mackay would have to be reused as part of the tower. Thus aspired to create a compelling entry and memorable identity for both the library and the seminary. I don't know what you did with this, but that was why we did it. We really felt, and I have to say I was probably castigated by some of my colleagues back in Boston who said this is too derivative. And so for any of you, no, there are no architects in the audience who will say this is really derivative. But but for you as a community here on the campus, this is very important, right? This has relevance for you. This has meaning for you. And that's what, quite honestly, I was trying to tap into. Combined with the challenge, because the spear tablets that Mackay conceived and Menconi fabricated, I mean, it's interesting. I don't think they'd ever been cleaned. So we were taking a chance here in terms of would they fit into the building. So they were taken down carefully. Then they were cleaned and they stayed intact, because that's always another risk, is that you do a power wash and next thing you know, things are evaporating before your eyes. And then we sort of made the proposition to separate them with the glass that comes down below, because we really wanted the horizontal, the verticality to be reinforced here, that one is looking towards the heavens. And in some ways, in combination with, if these are inventions in terms of an oriel window that's been engineered with 20th century technology that's been enhanced by 21st century improvements, this is the ancient stone version of that. And so making this whole figure, and I have to say, there was the sort of angel figuration in my mind, right? That these in fact are the wings to this figure, and that separation wasn't such a bad thing. Because I know the storyline going from the hand of God to the heart of Calvin, and all the various stories, narratives in between, we might be treading in a very dangerous place to separate them. But I guess at the end of the day, this seems to work. We're pretty happy with how the stone tablets, or the cast stone tablets, have fit into the existing building. That was a little bit of put us out there on a limb, but it seemed to work pretty well. So I think with that, to get back to light and delight, in our minds, that the combination of the various agenda items that were given to us to design the building, right? The library to the world and the techniques for achieving that sort of breakdown of the barriers. The library of last resort, the sense that this would be an inviting and compelling place that people would want to gather, to congregate, that we think we've had a little bit of an impact, but certainly with the test of time, and to see what improvements you guys make to it as this goes through. So that's where we are.